Little is known about John Bolsinger's childhood and formative years. When the Eugene Police Department reconstructed his life timeline during the cold case investigation, the earliest date they were able to anchor was 1975, when Bolsinger was around 18 years old. He was born on September 17, 1957 in Springfield, Oregon, a working-class city in the Willamette Valley. Springfield in the 1950s and 1960s was a smaller lumber and manufacturing town. Bolsinger remained connected to Springfield throughout his entire life. Despite spending stretches of time in Utah due to incarceration and later in Eugene due to his crimes, every time he was paroled or released from custody, he returned to Springfield. From early on in his life, Bolsinger began building a criminal record. Multiple sources describe him as having had a prior background in burglary and property crime before his first violent offense. By the spring of 1980, Bolsinger was 22 years old and living in Magna, Utah, a small suburb roughly 15 miles west of downtown Salt Lake City. He often visited a local bar called Bill's Lounge. On the evening of March 28th, a woman named KZ Sorensen, aged 33, stopped by Bill's Lounge. She was said to be a regular customer and was a deeply lonely woman who struggled with alcoholism. Her boyfriend of approximately 2 years, Mark Anger, was a firefighter who worked 24-hour shifts, leaving her alone. Anger would later testify that during his prolonged shifts, Sorensen had been bringing other men back to his apartment. That evening, Sorensen arrived at the bar sometime between 7:30 and 8 p.m., already intoxicated when she walked through the door. She sang along to the jukebox, danced by herself on the dance floor, and according to bartender Terry Pattison, was, quote, just looking for somebody to talk to, maybe find a friend or something. She moved up and down the length of the bar, kissing men on the cheek, behavior Pattison stated was normal by Sorensen's standards. John Bolsinger entered the bar around 9 p.m. and went to the pool table. At some point, Sorensen moved toward him. She kissed Bolsinger on the cheek several times and put her arms around him between shots. Shortly before 10 p.m., the two left the bar together. According to later accounts, Bolsinger first drove the two to his own home in Magna, where he retrieved a bottle of whiskey. From there, the two drove to Mark Anger's apartment. In the bedroom, the nightstand had 2 explicit adult books. One of the books contained 3 separate passages describing the deliberate restriction of oxygen for gratification. On the floor near the bed was a mail order catalog titled Romeo, Your Source of Pleasure, advertising various intimate devices, including devices specifically designed to restrict oxygen flow during intimacy. 2 additional magazines, Game and Penthouse, were also in the room. The trial court would later prohibit those 2 magazines from being shown to the jury, and the Romeo catalog would be lost by police before trial, making it unavailable for inspection by the defense. Bolsinger and Sorensen played records on the stereo, drank straight from the whiskey bottle, and danced in the apartment for approximately an hour. Both became significantly intoxicated and slept together in the bedroom. And it's from here on out that the 2 main accounts on this encounter begin to differ drastically. In the early morning hours of April 2nd, 1980, approximately 3 a.m., Bolsinger gave a taped confession to Detective Thompson of the Salt Lake City Police Department. In that recorded statement, Bolsinger told police the following: after they had been engaged in intercourse, Sorensen made a weird face. That's when he reached for the clock radio nearby on the bed, wrapped its cords around her neck, and began pulling. Bolsinger said she just laid there and didn't resist at all. When the detective asked how long he pulled the cord, Bolsinger replied that it had seemed like just a second. When asked if he had been angry, he said he had not been mad and that she had not said anything to him or poked fun at him. When asked if he knew why it had happened, his answer was, "Wish I did." When the detective asked if he had ever been involved in anything like that before, if he had ever hurt anyone, Bolsinger replied, "Never, not even close. Never ever hurt anybody before." This interaction ended up killing Sorensen. After she died, Bolsinger got up from the bed, covered her body with a sheet, walked into the living room, dumped the contents of her purse on the floor, finding no money, knocked over a lamp, and left the apartment carrying Mark Anger's stereo. At trial, Bolsinger denied the confession from start to finish. He testified that every word of it was a fabrication. His explanation for why he had lied was that he had been told by police that the crime scene looked looked like an assault and murder, and he understood that if he described a killing that had occurred outside the context of intercourse, he could face a capital charge. He believed the truth was simply too strange for anyone to accept, so he invented a story he thought might keep him off death row. His new version stated the following: after approximately 5 minutes with Sorensen, Bolsinger stopped to rest. He started to get up and Sorensen said no. He rolled off to the side. Sorensen rolled over to the nightstand, picked up the clock radio, and set it down next to her on the bed. Neither of them said anything about the radio, and they resumed. Bolsinger opened his eyes at some point and saw that the cord was around Sorensen's neck, stating that she had placed it there herself. Once again, they continued. He opened his eyes again when he heard her say the word pull. At that moment, Sorensen had the cord in her hands with her arms extended upward at approximately a 45-degree angle. When the defense attorney asked Bolsinger why he had taken hold of the cord, he answered, "She asked me to. I heard there was something like that, and I don't know where, but I heard something like that." He pulled the cord with the same amount of tension as one would use when tying their shoes and held that tension for around 15 to 20 seconds. Bolsinger rolled over to the side once again and looked over at Sorensen a few moments later and noticed that her face looked strange. He became afraid and got up. He gathered his clothes, went to the living room, and dressed before walking back into the bedroom. Sorensen was still in the same position. He stood there for a few moments, thought to put a sheet over her, then picked up his bottles of whiskey, returned to the living room, dumped the contents of her purse, left the apartment with the stereo, and drove away. He did not attempt to check whether she was breathing, did not call for help, and made no attempt to resuscitate her. He testified at trial that he had never intended to harm Sorensen in any way. Mark Anger returned from his firefighting shift on the afternoon of March 29th to find Sorensen's body spread eagled on the bed. Her legs were uncovered, the rest of her body was beneath a sheet. The cord of the clock radio resting on the bed was loosely wrapped around her neck. The Romeo catalog was on the floor near the bed. Anger noted that the living room looked like a burglary had taken place. Sorensen's purse contents were scattered, a lamp was knocked over, and his stereo was missing. Dr. Wallace Graham, the state medical examiner, performed Sorensen's autopsy on March 30th and conveyed the following information. Sorensen had been using a contraceptive at the time of death, and seminal fluid was present, confirming that intercourse had taken place. Her blood alcohol level was measured at 0.22, indicating intoxication at the time of death. There was no structural damage to the neck, and there was no evidence that the cord had ever been knotted or held in a tied position at any point. The ligature mark itself was described as a light abrasion, partially encircling the neck, not a full encirclement. There was no furrowing of the mark, which would indicate sustained or forceful pressure. Above the ligature mark, Graham found petechial hemorrhages, the rupture of small capillaries that is a hallmark finding in deaths from strangulation, present in both eyes, the right cheek, and the scalp. No hemorrhages were found below the ligature line. The only other external marks were 3 very superficial scratches on her right cheek, each between 1 and 2 millimeters long, and 3 small bruises, 1 on the back of her left hand and 2 on the top of her right foot. Graham estimated that unconsciousness would result within 5 to 10 seconds of the cord being applied. If the cord were released immediately at that point, breathing would resume on its own. However, if pressure was maintained past the point of unconsciousness, the victim could survive only if resuscitated within roughly 30 seconds to 2.5 minutes. He further testified that pressure applied to the throat of an intoxicated person would produce death more rapidly than in a sober person, a point that would become significant in the defense's argument. Graham classified the manner of death as homicide by strangulation. The defense called Dr. Boyd Stevens the chief medical examiner for the city and county of San Francisco, California. Stevens was one of the country's foremost authorities on a phenomenon known as intimate asphyxia. Based on his review, Stevens offered the opinion that Sorensen's death was an unintentional accident. Mark Anger also took the stand for the prosecution. His testimony, in several respects, aided the defense more than the state. He testified that Sorensen had a drinking problem, that during her drinking episodes she became severely depressed, and that she was someone who, quote, had to sleep with someone all the time. He added that she had difficulty reaching satisfaction and sometimes resorted to unorthodox means as a result. He acknowledged that he and Sorensen had read the books and magazines found in the bedroom and had explored some of the practices suggested in them, though he stated they had never engaged in anything involving strangulation specifically. He also admitted knowing that Sorensen had been bringing other men to his apartment during his absence in the weeks leading up to her death. During the trial, it was also revealed that Bolsinger had failed a polygraph test on the day he was questioned by police. When the results were shared with him, Bolsinger asked for a lawyer. This request, made in the presence of Officer Elliott, who administered the polygraph, was the first of what would become a sustained series of requests for counsel that stretched over the course of the next several hours. Ultimately, on March 6, 1981, Bolsinger was convicted. Then on April 23rd, he received an indeterminate term of 5 years to life. Bolsinger did not accept the verdict quietly. He appealed his conviction, and in a 3-1 ruling, the Utah Supreme Court withdrew the second-degree murder conviction, citing the state's failure to provide sufficient evidence that Bolsinger had intended to cause grave bodily harm to Sorensen. As a result, the charge was reduced to manslaughter, and his sentence was adjusted accordingly. In December 1985, Bolsinger joined 3 other inmates in a separate appeal to the Utah Supreme Court, arguing that the Utah State Prison lacked adequate legal research resources for prisoners pursuing civil cases. That joint appeal was rejected. With his conviction reduced and his time served, Bolsinger was paroled to his hometown of Springfield, Oregon on March 7, 1986. For about 3 months, he lived an uneventful life. That was until his encounter with a 62-year-old woman named Gladys May Hensley. She lived alone in an apartment at 255 High Street in Eugene. On June 5, 1986, at approximately 2:42 p.m., the Eugene Police Department and fire medics were dispatched to her address following a welfare check. An employee of the apartment complex had initiated the check after Hensley had not been seen for several days. When officers entered the apartment, they found her lifeless body on the floor. The subsequent investigation revealed that Hensley had almost certainly been killed in the early morning hours of June 4th, meaning her body had been on the floor of her apartment for roughly 30 to 36 hours before anyone called to check on her. The apartment showed evidence of forced entry. Unknown to investigators, the man who had broken in was Bolsinger himself. After entering Hensley's apartment, he violated her before taking her life. The exact cause and manner of death were not publicly disclosed, but the attack itself was said to have involved violent strangulation. Additionally, there was evidence of injuries that involved a sharp instrument, such as a knife. Police were unable to identify any suspects in the immediate aftermath of her murder. No witness had seen anyone breaking in, and the scene contained no useful leads. The case was classified as a homicide, and investigators began the slow work of trying to establish who might have had access to the building or had known Hensley. None of these avenues produced a viable suspect. Just 14 days after the Hensley incident, and at a location only approximately 10 blocks away, investigators were confronted with yet another assault and murder. This marked 2 women within a 10-block radius of each other. This second woman, Janice Dickinson, was 33 years old at the time of her death. She was last seen alive near Alton Baker Park in Eugene. This park is a large public green space located on an island in the Willamette River directly north of the University of Oregon campus. It is the kind of place where people walk, jog, socialize, and gather, entirely unremarkable and non-threatening in character. Dickinson was on foot and by herself at the time she was last observed. According to investigators, she had been visiting with people and was in good spirits. From Alton Baker Park, it is believed Dickinson made her way along 20 Coburg Road. During this journey, she was either followed or Bolsinger had confronted her himself somewhere along the route. Ultimately, her unclothed body was found behind a car dealership along the same road. The person who discovered her body first was a mechanic employed at the same car dealership. Dickinson was found beneath a tree on the sloped embankment below Highway 126. The position was sort of screened off from the highway so that drivers could not see the body. The autopsy confirmed that Dickinson had been stabbed, strangled, assaulted, and beaten to death. Like Hensley, the violence inflicted was prolonged and described as overkill. Police investigated her friends, searched her home and her car, but found no information pointing to any particular person of interest. Then, in September 1986, Bolsinger was arrested for an unrelated attempted burglary in Springfield and was sent back to prison. The timing was significant. The Hensley and Dickinson murders had occurred in June 1986. Bolsinger's burglary arrest occurred in September. With him removed from the streets, the pattern of violence in Eugene associated with his method broke. Over the years that followed, as investigators continued working the cases, they developed and investigated multiple persons of interest. Every single one was eliminated from their list. Fast forward to December 8, 1987, at the age of 30, Bolsinger was released on parole. 3 days after his release, he enrolled at Lane Community College in Eugene for the upcoming 1988 winter term. Central to Bolsinger's next arc is a woman named Geraldine Toohey. She was 73 years old and lived alone. She was connected enough to family that her sister was in regular telephone contact with her, and she visited church every week. On the night of February 27, 1988, Toohey was on the phone with her sister when the line suddenly went dead. Bolsinger had cut the phone lines before entering the residence. What followed inside was an act of extreme violence. Bolsinger forced his way into the home and stabbed, violated, and strangled Toohey. Her body was discovered the following morning. The person who found her was her sister, who had stopped by her home to pick her up for church. She knocked and called out for her but received no response. Eventually, she was able to gain entry into the residence to find her sister dead. Unlike the previous two murders, this particular incident came with something the others did not: a witness. That witness worked with a police artist to produce a composite sketch of the suspected perpetrator. On March 5, 1988, 6 days after Toohey's body was discovered, the Oregon State Police released the sketch to the public. At the time, no connection to John Bolsinger was made by anyone, either in law enforcement or the public. He was not a person of interest in any of the three murders. He had no outstanding warrants, and he had no reason that investigators were aware of to be connected to Geraldine Toohey specifically. However, the release of this sketch did have a profound effect on one person in particular, that being Bolsinger himself. On March 23rd, just under 3 weeks after the sketch went public, Bolsinger was found dead inside his apartment at the 100 block of Mill Street in Springfield. He had taken his own life. No source has publicly disclosed whether a note was found, and no family member or acquaintance has come forward with any account of his mental state in the period leading up to March 23rd. He was buried without being charged and without anyone in the public record ever connecting his name to the three women he had killed. What is commonly believed by officials to have occurred was that Bolsinger had stumbled upon his own sketch tied to Toohey's murder and became severely unnerved. It is possible that he was not ready to face the consequences of 3 murders piled onto his already lengthy criminal record. In the years following Bolsinger's death, police continued working the cases as resources allowed. Numerous persons of interest were identified and investigated over the years, but each one was cleared. All 3 cases lacked strong physical leads beyond some biological evidence recovered from the crime scenes. But in May 2018, the case would begin to finally crack. Parabon Nanolabs expanded its services to include genetic genealogy, a technique that had just months earlier played a decisive role in the identification of Joseph James DeAngelo as the infamous Golden State Killer. In regard to the 3 murders Bolsinger had committed, officials narrowed the search down to 4 potential suspects. Further analysis left John Bolsinger as the last man standing. After being identified as the prime suspect, detectives began reconstructing Bolsinger's life history from 1975 to 1988. Every piece of the timeline fit. Each murder occurred within weeks of Bolsinger being free, and each period of incarceration corresponded to a break in the killings. On February 2nd, 2022, the Eugene Police Department held a press conference announcing that the cold cases of Gladys Hensley, Janice Dickinson, and Geraldine Toohey had been officially solved. John Bolsinger, dead for nearly 34 years, was named as the killer of all 3 women. In their official statement, officials said several persons of interest were developed and thoroughly investigated over the years and were excluded. After extensive follow-up and the analysis of additional evidence, the suspect was identified as John Charles Bolsinger. Nancy Agnes Hazel, often referred to as Nannie, was born on November 4th, 1905 in Blue Mountain, Alabama, a small rural community nestled in Calhoun County between the towns of Anniston and Jacksonville. Blue Mountain could barely even be considered a town. It was a scattering of farmsteads, unpaved roads, and families that had lived within a few miles of one another for generations. The United States in 1905 was still a nation where rural poverty was the norm for millions of families, particularly in the Deep South. Alabama at the turn of the century remained heavily divided along lines of race, class, and gender. Farming families like the Hazels avoided destitute lifestyles but were far from comfortable, depending entirely on seasonal crop yields. Children in such households were expected to carry their own shares of labor, and schooling and aspirations were treated as secondary or disregarded entirely. It was into this world that Nancy Hazel arrived as one of 5 children born to James and Louisa Hazel. The Hazel household consisted of Nannie, 1 brother, and 3 sisters. Her father, James, worked as a railroader before eventually taking over the family farm around 1920, when Nannie was in her early teens. Her mother, Louisa, was described by multiple sources as warm and loving, a sharp contrast to James, whom both Nannie and Louisa reportedly despised. To understand Nannie, it is essential to understand James Hazel in detail because virtually every trauma that would occur and compound over her childhood originated with him. He was, by all accounts, a controlling, abusive, and domineering man who treated his household as property rather than a family. The primary instrument of his control was labor. James forced all 5 of his kids to remain home from school for extended, often indefinite periods of time in order to perform chores and tend to the family farm. Nannie's schooling was so disrupted and so irregular that her academic development was severely stunted. One source notes that her formal education effectively ended after the 6th grade. She struggled to read fluently for much of her life, though it was noted that she had a natural perceptiveness to her that often made up for her shortcomings. James's control over his daughters extended far beyond labor. He forbade all 4 of his girls from wearing makeup or fashionable clothing because he believed that if his daughters presented themselves attractively, they would attract the attention of men and be violated. He enforced social quarantine as well. Nannie and her sisters were barred from attending dances, social gatherings, and other community events. In a rural community where social life revolved entirely around church community dances and neighborhood gatherings, this rule was a near-total exclusion from social interaction. Nannie grew up without the chance to develop an identity outside of her role as a farm laborer and her father's daughter. Nannie's mother, Louisa, was a victim of James's domineering temperament as much as the children were. Multiple accounts characterize the relationship between Nannie and her mother as genuinely close. The two shared an implicit alliance forged by their mutual resentment of James. Louisa provided the warmth and tenderness that James withheld entirely, and for young Nannie, her mother represented the only reliable source of emotional comfort and genuine affection in the household. This bond with Louisa would be one of the few stable threads running through Nannie's otherwise chaotic emotional life, which makes the fact that Nannie later poisoned her own mother one of the most strange and disturbing elements of the entire case. In 1912, when Nannie was approximately 7 years old, the Hazel family boarded a train to visit relatives in southern Alabama. For Nannie and her siblings, this trip was an extraordinary event since their lives almost entirely revolved around the farm. During the journey, the train made an abrupt stop. The force of this was violent enough to throw passengers forward in their seats. Nannie was thrown from her seat and struck her forehead directly on the metal bar on the back of the seat in front of her. Accounts of the incident consistently describe the blow as carrying significant force, enough to where Nannie was visibly disoriented afterward. From that point forward, Nannie reported suffering from severe recurring headaches that would continue for the rest of her life. In the months and years following the accident, she also experienced blackouts and extended bouts of depression that could last for weeks. In rural Alabama in 1912, there was no meaningful medical intervention available for a child with a head injury. More than likely, all she received as treatment was rest and home remedies. The likely structural damage to her brain, if any occurred, went entirely unaddressed. It's often speculated that what had happened was that Nannie's frontal lobe had been damaged. This area governs executive function, including impulse control, emotional regulation, moral reasoning, and more. Injuries to this region, particularly in developing brains, are consistently associated with increased impulsivity, emotional instability, and, in some documented cases, a reduced capacity for empathy. Research cited in forensic analyses of Nannie's case explicitly connects frontal lobe injuries to increased incidence of violent and uncontrollable social behavior in adulthood. Now, it should go without saying that an injury like this does not immediately create a dangerous person, but in Nannie's case in particular, it certainly did not help her situation. Nannie herself leveraged the accident as both an explanation and an excuse for her behavior throughout her adult life and during her legal proceedings. The combination of James's restrictions and the physical after effects of the train accident placed young Nannie in a condition of profound deprivation. She had no self-identity and no future she could point toward. Into this vacuum came romance magazines. Louisa kept a collection of these. They featured serialized love stories and the Lonely Hearts columns in which readers advertised themselves to potential partners. For Nannie, these magazines were not mere entertainment. They were, in every meaningful sense, an alternative world, a realm in which women were desired, cherished, and pursued. The Lonely Hearts columns in particular captured her attention. For a girl who was not allowed to attend social gatherings, who had no male peers she was permitted to interact with, this represented the only conceivable pathway to the romantic life she craved. It should be emphasized that Nannie created a fantasy in her mind where she desired a loving partner to usher her into a so-called perfected version of life. She wanted a devoted husband who would sweep her off her feet, provide for her financially, and view her as the center of his world. She had no examples of healthy partnerships in her home. She never learned to calibrate romantic expectations against ordinary human flaws and complexity. One of the most devastating and least discussed elements of Nannie's life are the instances of violence carried out against her. According to multiple sources, Nannie was violated multiple times by local men. It was well known throughout the local area that Nannie's father exercised total control over his family and that any complaints made by his daughters were unlikely to be taken seriously. When Nannie disclosed the assaults to her father, James refused to believe her. He simply dismissed what his daughter told him. These events created a contradictory emotional outlook on men for Nannie. She still longed for a male protector who valued her and kept her safe, but there was no denying her deep, pent-up fury toward them as well. She would go on to pursue men with genuine urgency and romantic hope, marry them quickly, and then, when they inevitably fell short of the ideal she had carried since childhood, she would respond violently. Skip forward to 1921, when Nannie was 16 years old. Her father allowed her to take a job at the linen thread company in Anniston. The mill was only a short distance from the family's farm in Blue Mountain. It was one of the few times James ever allowed his daughters to have some semblance of independence, and even then it served the family's financial interests rather than Nannie's. The work was grueling and repetitive, and the pay was poor. But for a teenage girl who had spent her entire life confined to a farm, simply getting to experience freedom was enough. Additionally, this new setting put her in proximity to people her own age, specifically men. It was at the thread company that Nannie met Charles Braggs. Braggs was also employed at the mill and was several years older than Nannie. He began pursuing her, and despite only knowing each other for about 4 months, he proposed marriage. The speed of the proposal was not particularly unusual by the standards of the rural South in the 1920s, particularly for young women with few other prospects. James Hazel gave his blessing quickly. Nannie herself later described the circumstances of the marriage in a written statement. She wrote, "I married as my father wished in 1921 to a boy I only knew about 4 or 5 months, who had no family, only a mother who was unwed and who had taken over my life completely when we were married." She had never seen anything wrong with what he had done, but she would take spells. She would not let my own mother stay all night. This excerpt communicates the helplessness she felt after being married off by her father's arrangement to a man she barely knew, and being absorbed into a household governed by yet another controlling authority figure. The marriage began with what Nannie would later describe as decent enough intentions on Braggs's part, but the arrangement proved suffocating almost immediately. She moved into the home that Charlie shared with his mother, who was described as intensely possessive of her son. In several accounts, it was stated that if Braggs's mother did not get her way, or if Nannie was spending too much time with Braggs, she would fake being ill in order to get her son's attention. This worked every single time. Additionally, Braggs proved to be a man of considerable flaws beneath whatever initial appeal he had held. He was unfaithful, and he was an inconsistent, unreliable presence in the household, frequently absent for days at a time without explanation. Nannie, who had entered the marriage carrying an idealized vision of marriage built from years of reading romance magazines, found herself instead performing the labor of a housekeeper. To cope with the disappointment, Nannie began drinking heavily and smoking. Eventually, Nannie had had enough and also began to engage in infidelity during the marriage. Despite the turbulence of the relationship, Nannie and Braggs had 4 daughters together between 1923 and 1927. The eldest was Melvina, followed by 2 middle daughters, and finally a newborn named Florine, born in 1927. The household by this point was severely strained as Nannie became more and more dependent on alcohol to manage her unhappiness. In the early part of 1927, the 2 middle daughters died. It was accepted that they died of food poisoning, but it should be noted that no physician ever formally documented a cause of death. Rural Alabama in the 1920s was not an area with robust systems for forensic investigation of childhood deaths. It was not uncommon for children to die from various ailments and infections, so another 2 fatalities from supposed natural foodborne illnesses did not immediately raise alarm. One day, Braggs received an anonymous warning telling him not to eat or drink anything that his wife had prepared. Shortly after the deaths of the 2 middle daughters, he gathered the eldest child, Melvina, and left the home, abandoning the marriage and, critically, the newborn Florine, whom he left behind in Nannie's care. Not long after Braggs left with Melvina, his mother, who had remained in the home, died. The timing was close enough to the other deaths to be noted by later investigators, though it was initially attributed to natural causes as she was already very old. Braggs stayed away for the better part of a year after his departure. Nannie, now alone in the home with the infant Florine and presumably without the financial support of a husband, found a job at a local cotton mill to keep herself and her daughter fed. In the summer of 1928, Braggs returned with his daughter. He had met another woman and wanted a formal divorce. Nannie consented and the divorce was finalized. Afterward, it appears that Braggs left both daughters with Nannie upon his final departure. She packed up her children and moved back into her parents' home. Almost immediately upon settling back in, she began reading the Lonely Hearts columns once more. Her fantasy had not been extinguished by the failure of the first marriage. If anything, this collapse appeared to have confirmed the fantasy rather than undermining it. In Nannie's internal logic, the marriage had failed not because the ideal of romantic love was unrealistic, but because Braggs had been the wrong man. The next man, found through the right means, would be different. He would be the one who matched what she had imagined. In 1929, Nannie placed an advertisement in the newspaper. Not long after, a man named Robert Franklin Harrelson of Jacksonville, Alabama responded. Harrelson was 23 years old, described by those who knew him as physically attractive, and he pursued Nannie exactly the way she had always craved. He devoted all of his attention to her and even wrote her letters filled with poetry. Nannie, finally receiving what she has craved all her life, sent intimately charged letters back and even some photographs of herself. Later that same year, they married and settled in Jacksonville. The honeymoon phase was brief, and what came after it was devastating. Harrelson revealed himself to be a severe alcoholic with a criminal record for assault. By the time Nannie learned the truth about who her husband actually was, the wedding was already done. The marriage that followed was the longest of Nannie's life at 16 years, and by all available accounts, it was relentlessly grim. Harrelson's alcoholism frequently led to violent outbursts that were directed at Nannie. Furthermore, he also slept with other women. This brings into question why Nannie even decided to stay in this relationship for so long despite the terrible conditions of the arrangement. Many believe it was due to a combination of factors. Divorce already carried a significant social stigma, particularly for a woman on her second marriage with children from her first. There was also the matter of needing financial support and the uncertainty that came if Nannie were to divorce once more. By 1943, Nannie's eldest daughter, Melvina, was an adult and had married. Melvina gave birth to her first child, Robert Haynes, that same year. 2 years later, in 1945, Melvina gave birth to a second child. She was in the hospital recovering from labor and still groggy from the ether that was administered as an anesthetic. Again, Nannie was present in the room. What Melvina later reported seeing while drifting in and out of consciousness was her mother inserting a long hat pin into the soft spot at the top of the newborn skull. The infant died shortly afterward, and the cause of death could not be medically explained by the physicians. Melvina, still recovering from birth and from the shock of what she believed she had witnessed, attempted to get help. She told her husband and her sister Florine. Neither of them reported seeing anything strange and doubted Melvina's claims. When summer hit, it brought along another tragedy. Melvina, grieving the death of her newborn and separated from her husband, had begun seeing a new man romantically, a relationship of which Nannie explicitly disapproved. This escalated into a serious argument. In the aftermath of the fight, Melvina chose to leave the house temporarily to visit her father, Braggs, to decompress. She left her toddler son, Robert Haynes, in the care of his grandmother, Nannie. On July 7, 1945, Robert died. The cause of death recorded was asphyxia. 2 months after Robert's death, Nannie collected a $500 life insurance payout that she had prepared prior. This is among the most damning documented details of the entire early period of Nannie's crimes. 2 months later, on September 15th, Nannie's second husband, Frank Harrelson, died. Harrelson had come home drunk and assaulted Nannie. The following day, she was tending to her rose garden when she found one of Harrelson's hidden jars of corn whiskey. He had buried it in the yard, as was common practice among men who feared their wives might dispose of their liquor supply. Nannie dug it up and laced it with rat poison before returning it to where she had found it. Harrelson drank most of the contents of the jar and died. His death was attributed to food poisoning or, in some accounts, to acute alcoholism. No autopsy was performed. The period after this murder and Nannie's third marriage is poorly documented, but it is often cited that she began traveling extensively via train. She reached as far as New York and Idaho and never seemed to settle in any single location for too long. Whether she was searching for the next romantic prospect, avoiding any lingering suspicion following Harrelson's death, or something else entirely is tough to say. More troubling is the documented possibility of a man named Hendricks. Police investigators, when the information surfaced during the investigation into Nannie's crimes, never fully pursued this lead. Whether Hendricks was a husband or a drifting lover is unknown. What is confirmed is that by 1947, Nannie had collected additional life insurance money from her late husband's death and used a portion to purchase land and a house back in Jacksonville, Alabama. At some point, she once again returned to using Lonely Hearts to find a new husband. This brought her into contact with Arlie Lanning, a man from Lexington, North Carolina, who had originally come from Alabama. Lanning came from a normal background, and like with all of Nannie's prior relationships, this one also escalated into marriage quickly. Lanning was, as he was later described by locals, a man who drank heavily and was known to sleep around with women other than his wife. The people of the local Methodist congregation, of which Nannie became an active member, whispered about Lanning's ways, but kept their opinions carefully private out of respect for Nannie, whom they viewed as his long-suffering, devoted wife. What made the Lanning marriage functionally different from the Harrelson marriage was the dynamic between the spouses. With Harrelson, Nannie felt more or less trapped and simply chose to endure. But with Lanning, whenever Nannie felt her husband was out of line, she packed up her suitcase and left. These absences could drag out for as long as several weeks or months at a time. Lanning wasn't happy with these departures, but apparently accepted them. He was not brutal as Harrelson had been. He didn't chase her or threaten consequences. When she came home, he would acknowledge her return and attempt to recommit to the marriage with pledges of loyalty. When questioned as to where she went on her trips out, Nannie typically stated that she had taken on caretaking duties across the country. These explanations were largely accepted at face value, partly because they were sometimes true and partly because of the respectable image she maintained in this new marriage. About 3 years later, sometime in February 1950, Lanning sat down for breakfast that Nannie had prepared for him. It consisted of a cup of coffee and a bowl of stewed prunes. Lanning ate and drank what his wife had prepared and within hours was seriously ill. He suffered for approximately 2 days before dying. The attending physician examined him and attributed the death to heart failure, which seemed reasonable due to his chronic drinking. There was also the compounding factor of a flu virus that had been circulating through North Carolina at the time that closely resembled arsenic poisoning's initial presentation. The physician later said that in cases like Lanning's, an autopsy would have been redundant. Nannie later confessed to investigators that she had added rat poison to Lanning's food. Details on her exact approach differ. Some sources report her administering smaller doses over a longer period of time before the final lethal one finished the job. Lanning's will, when it was read following his death, produced a development that Nannie had not anticipated. The house in which they lived had been left not to her, but to Lanning's sister. The house then burned down, but the incident was never sufficiently investigated to prove that it was arson. What is documented is that Nannie filed an insurance claim on the property, regardless of whether she legally owned it, and collected the payout. Lanning's elderly mother, aged 84, who Nannie allegedly took care of for periods of time, died in her sleep not long after her son's death. Her death was attributed to natural causes and her advanced age. Given what is now known about Nannie's history of eliminating people in her care, the timing and circumstances of this death are regarded by investigators and criminologists as suspicious, though it was never formally charged as a homicide. Following her third marriage, Nannie concluded that North Carolina had nothing more to offer her and made her way back toward Alabama. Her first stop was to her sister Dovie's residence. One of the stated reasons for her previous absences from the Lanning household had been visits to Dovie, who had been diagnosed with cancer and was bedridden. Dovie died shortly after Nannie's arrival, and it was attributed to her illness. No autopsy was performed and no investigation was launched. Unlike the previous murders she was involved in, this one was particularly unsettling. Eliminating her husbands seemed to come with some level of payoff in the end. However, Dovie's death seemed to be entirely absent of a motive. Following this, Nannie traveled and eventually settled long enough to join a dating service called the Diamond Circle Club in 1952. Members of the club paid a fee and received a monthly newsletter featuring member profiles, photographs, and contact information. The club specifically catered to middle-aged adults, primarily widowed or divorced. The man who captured Nannie's attention was Richard Lewis Morton Sr., a resident of Jamestown, North Carolina, though their marriage would ultimately take place in Emporia, Kansas. Morton was described across sources as a man who, unlike most of Nannie's previous husbands, did not have a drinking problem. He was financially stable and overall well put together. But as always, the red flags began to become apparent after marriage. Morton was frequently cheating on his wife. He had been unfaithful to previous partners before meeting Nannie and continued the behavior, venturing into town for extended periods to be with other women. Shortly after this marriage, in January 1953, Nannie's mother, Louisa, suffered a serious fall that broke her hip. After her husband's death, Louisa had been living alone, but the injury made that impossible. Nannie agreed to take care of her, and Louisa came to live with her and Morton in Kansas. If you recall, Louisa was one of the few, if not the only, source of genuine love and warmth in Nannie's life, and yet she was dead within days of arriving in the new home. She began complaining of severe stomach pains shortly after her arrival and died not long thereafter. No investigation was conducted, and the reason for the murder was never revealed. Nannie herself, even after her confessions, was reluctant to acknowledge harming her biological family directly. 3 months after Louisa's death on May 19th, Richard Morton died as well. He too consumed coffee containing arsenic. His death was attributed to natural causes and was buried without an autopsy. At this point, her total kill count included at least 3 husbands, 2 grandchildren, her mother, her sister, and a mother-in-law. She had done all of this across 4 states. Each time, she presented a soft, grief-stricken facade, and no one suspected her or ever accused her of any crimes. Additionally, she had also already been in contact with the next man, a minister named Samuel Doss in Tulsa, Oklahoma, who had responded to her Lonely Hearts ad. The letters had been going back and forth for some time before Morton's death. Barely 1 month after Morton was buried, Nannie boarded a bus to Tulsa. They married in June 1953, and Nannie moved into Samuel's home. For a brief initial period, this relationship seemed like it had a chance to last. Samuel was not violent, didn't drink, and was loyal. He was objectively better than every man she had been with before. Nevertheless, the union would eventually come apart. Despite Samuel's positives, Nannie saw a number of unacceptable qualities. Samuel was deeply devout and held traditional conservative views. He believed that reading material and entertainment should be educational and morally uplifting. He forbade Nannie from reading her romance novels and magazines, which served as a favorite way to spend time. Similarly, she was not allowed to watch love stories or melodramas on TV, which Nannie often arranged her evenings around. With each passing day, Samuel's controlling nature reminded her more and more of her late father. Once she had enough, Nannie packed her things and walked out, refusing to return. This was a strategic negotiation maneuver. Samuel wanted his wife back and began to beg. Nannie agreed to return, but only if certain conditions were met. She required Samuel put her name on his bank account, giving her direct access to his finances. He also needed to take out not 1, but 2 life insurance policies on himself, with Nannie named as the sole beneficiary of both. Samuel agreed and Nannie came home. Over a year passed between the return and the first attempt on Samuel's life. In September 1954, Nannie baked a prune cake for her husband and laced it with arsenic. After eating, Samuel became seriously ill. He was admitted to a hospital where doctors diagnosed him with a severe gastrointestinal tract infection. Arsenic poisoning was not immediately suspected, and Samuel was treated for the infection rather than for poisoning. He was hospitalized for approximately 1 month, during which the doctors attempted to stabilize his condition, which improved as he received hydration and care that essentially diluted and cleared the arsenic from his system without anyone realizing that was what was happening. During this period, his primary doctor, Dr. Schwelbein, quietly harbored doubts. The order and time it took for his condition to get worse before improving did not follow the expected course of an infection. Samuel was discharged from the hospital on October 5th, 1954. He was weaker and thinner than he had been before the illness, but the doctors decided he was at the point where he could now recover at home. Almost immediately, Nannie attempted to poison Samuel again. Accounts differ on when exactly this occurred, with some placing the date on October 6th and others on October 12th. After the couple had dinner, Nannie gave her husband a cup of coffee that contained arsenic. Samuel drank it and within hours died. When Dr. Schwelbein learned of the death, he made a request to perform an autopsy on Samuel. He did not immediately accuse Nannie of a crime, but stated that learning more about Samuel's unusual case could help future patients. Nannie agreed. She had been using arsenic for nearly 3 decades and had never had a victim autopsied. She may have believed that death itself was sufficient to conceal the evidence. Through the procedure, it was revealed that Samuel had consumed enough arsenic to kill a horse. Dr. Schwelbein contacted the Tulsa police immediately, leading to Nannie's arrest on October 30th. The lead investigator was Captain Harry Stegg. Stegg was an experienced officer who had interrogated criminals and suspects of all kinds, and he had prepared for a session with a defensive, belligerent older woman who would deny everything and require careful, sustained questioning to break down. What he found instead was something entirely different. Upon first interaction, Nannie smiled. She was pleasant and cooperative. She was chatty and talked freely about her life, her marriages, cooking, and her opinions on various subjects, but she was careful not to discuss the murders, at least initially. At some point in the early phase of the questioning, Nannie was given a romance magazine. With the magazine in her hands, Nannie was even less focused on the questions being put to her. She would flip through the pages, comment on a story she found particularly interesting, and generally act as though this was a pleasant afternoon meant for reading rather than a serious murder interrogation. The investigators were baffled and grew increasingly frustrated. The turning point came when the lead investigator took the magazine away from her. This appears to have genuinely irritated Nannie. They told her they had made phone calls and that they knew things about her past marriages. They told her that the amount of arsenic found in Samuel's system could not possibly be accidental. Nannie giggled and then she began to talk. The initial confession focused on the most recent husband. She admitted to poisoning Samuel, and her reason was that he would not let her watch her favorite TV show or read her stories. When she revealed this, she did so in a cheerful, matter-of-fact way. She then admitted to the murders of Frank Harrelson, Arlie Lanning, and Richard Morton, giggling throughout the confessions. Each admission came with a similar account of poisoning. When pressed about Richard Morton, Nannie initially denied knowing him and claimed she had no relationship with the man. The investigators produced 5 life insurance policies totaling approximately $1,400 at the time, all bearing her name as sole beneficiary. To this, she said, "Well, you got me trapped. I guess I did know him." Beyond the 4 husbands she confessed to killing, Nannie also admitted in separate interrogation sessions to the murders of her mother Louisa, her grandson Robert Haynes, and Lanning's mother. She did not confess to killing her daughters, the infant granddaughter she allegedly harmed with a hat pin, her sister Dovie, or Morton's 2.5-year-old grandson. Interestingly, in the period between Samuel's death and her arrest, Nannie had already identified and was in contact with a new prospective husband, a man who resided in North Carolina named John Keel. In fact, Nannie had baked him a cake shortly before her arrest, which worried investigators. However, John was still alive and well. Ultimately, charges came from the states of Oklahoma, North Carolina, Kansas, and Alabama, but she was only ever tried in Oklahoma. This was largely due to officials viewing the additional trials as being unnecessary from a practical standpoint. On May 17, 1955, Nannie pleaded guilty to the first-degree murder of Samuel Doss. Her defense attorney attempted to argue insanity, citing her childhood head injury, but psychiatrists evaluated her and determined she was fully competent to stand trial. She was then sentenced to life in prison. Oklahoma did not pursue the death penalty as the state could not execute women under its laws at the time, and the presiding judge also expressed reluctance to set a precedent by executing a woman. Throughout the trial, Nannie remained eerily composed, smiling and occasionally giggling as her crimes were described in open court. She was placed in the Oklahoma State Penitentiary in McAlester. She was assigned to work in the prison laundry, a detail she reportedly found amusing, noting that prison officials had politely declined her repeated offers to work in the kitchen. She retained her cheerful disposition throughout her incarceration and was known to make jokes about her cases to other inmates and to journalists who sought her out for interviews. Within 2 years of her sentencing, Nannie stated that she had come to regret receiving a life sentence rather than the death penalty. This was not due to remorse, but rather she was simply dissatisfied with the length of the sentence. On June 2, 1965, Nannie died of leukemia in the penitentiary. She was subsequently buried at Oak Hill Memorial Park in McAlester, Oklahoma.